So let's get started with our first speaker, the global keynote speaker for World Information Architecture Day, architect turned information architect, co-founder of World IA Day, the author of not one, but 3 information architecture books, Andrea Resmini, and he's about to join us live from Sweden. Yeah. Hi, Andrea, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I mean, thanks for making me a part of your lovely event. And let me get into a part of the global keynote, or the central part of the global keynote. World Information Architecture Day is part of an information revolution that has been long coming. Our digital transformation is the long tail of a process that started with the electrical telegraph in the 1830s. Telegraph was the first large-scale technology that could transmit pure information instantaneously over long distances. It made space and distance irrelevant. After the telegraph, the rhythm just picked up. The telephone, the radio, television, ARPANET, Usenet, FidoNet, the internet, then the web, mobile phones, smartphones, social media. Today, the amount of digital, easily shareable information we produce, share, and consume on a daily basis is astounding. This immersion in information comes with quite a few perks and with plenty of downsides, and we know about those. It also compels us to center our lives on what's coming next. If we're lucky, we trade some depth for a broader reach. If we're not, well, we trade into shallow waters. In both cases, it keeps us on the wheel, running along, feeding our fear of missing out. And here's the problem. Change is hard enough. It's hardest when we try to change something we are not familiar with. And telling people what information architecture is, what it was, well, we haven't been great at that. There's history there we haven't passed on. What IA Day itself is 14 years old. It wasn't made today. The IA conference, formerly the Information Architecture Summit, will celebrate its 26th edition in a little more than a month. International events, such as the Italian Information Architecture Summit, are old enough to order a drink, at least in Europe. Information architecture itself has a 60-year-long journey behind its back. Most of us weren't there, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And adapting information architecture for this evolving world, knowing where it's going, cannot really be made without knowing where it's coming from. So here's a quick recap. Information architecture, as we understand it today, sees the light in the 60s, with the pioneering work carried out in the United States at the IBM labs and at Xerox PARC on human-computer interactions and system behavior. PARC gave us foundational computing concepts and artifacts from Ethernet to the GUI, and it's the place where, in the early 70s, work on human-computer interaction and the social aspects of computing is framed as a concerted effort to devise, design, and test the architecture of information for the office of the future. In those same years, on the other coast, American architect Richard Saul Wurman, the future creator of the TED conference, introduces a modern formulation of information architecture that we still use today. In a world without the internet, and in which PARC sells 2,000 computers, Wurman believes that the explosion of data needs an architecture, needs systems, needs systemic design. He starts calling himself an information architect, not a bricks and mortar architect, but rather the person who puts in place systemic, structural, and orderly principles to make something work. This making of either artifacts or idea of policy helps make the complex clear and creates the structure or map of information which allows others to find their personal paths to knowledge. The 80s are difficult and difficult to read. The human-centered vision of technology that is developed at Park and women's architectural push for clarity do not meet. The conversation shifts. Information architecture begins to be used primarily as a synonym for computer architecture. But it's also in the 80s that Women publishes two seminal information architecture texts, a book, Information Anxiety, and a special issue of Design Quarterly called Hats. Here, he introduces what will later become his location, alphabet, time, category, hierarchy approach, LATCH for short, and makes relationships, the space between things, central to architecting information. After all, says Women, we only understand something relative to something we already understand. In the 90s, the emergence of the web gives information architecture its niche of opportunity and the chance to strike gold. Lou Rosenfeld and Peter Morville are the central figures of this second wave. Rosenfeld and Joe James opened Argus Associates in 1995. Morville is the agency's first hire. Argus grows rapidly and to great success, precising Rosenfeld and Morville's 1998 Information Architecture for the World Wide Web its most important legacy. The book, widely known as the Polar Bear because of its cover, draws heavily from library and information science and establishes taxonomies, classification, and labels for online content as the domain of information architecture. The noughties are a contradiction. In the United States, the bubble of investments that has supported the early growth of the web bursts. As the economy suddenly collapses, the importance of an online presence is questioned or deprioritized. The practice contracts, producing conflict and stagnation. Many read these as signs of an impending death of information architecture. On this side of the Atlantic, the European Information Architecture Summit has its premiere in Brussels in 2005 and is followed by the Italian IA Summit in 2006 and by the German IA Conference in 2007. As much as the birth of the web was the catalyst for the second wave, steeped in library and information science, the bleeding of the web and digital information into the built environment that begins in the late noughties is the catalyst for a third wave that builds on these. The third wave is not a rejection of Polar Bear information architecture, it's an enrichment. The information spaces we have been designing for the past 30 years have changed around us. They are not just catalogs, libraries that we access via screen. They are the complex layered spaces that exist between devices, services, locations, and people in which our experiences unfold. Some parts of them are distant in time, some are distant in space. Digital is enmeshed into the physical world in 1,000 different ways. It is there, it's banal, it's only noticed when it's absent. Polar Bear information architecture would naturally focus on how to design websites, the new information spaces of the time, pay specific attention to the structure and language of the individual pages, the relationship between the pages, and how to carefully balance content, context, and people's goals. Wireframes, diagrams, maps, and language documents would be common sense deliverables. Contemporary information architecture extends these roots and recognizes that the work of many practitioners and some scholars commonly stretches outside of these traditional boundaries into voice interfaces, shared mobility, wearables, house automation, smart environments of all kinds. Its focus is on post-digital rather than digital-only experiences. Experiences that take place in the discontinuous, blended information space in which people move from a mobile app to a store, from a real-time display to a card reader, from a website to a classroom, without ever worrying, as long as everything works, whether any single moment is either digital or physical. 30 years since Argus Associates, more than 60 years from Park, we have the gift of hindsight. Still, change can be hard. Humans are creatures of habit. We resist moving on, we resist change, we resist letting go. But we won't adapt if we don't let go of the identification of information architecture with making websites that took hold between the late 90s and the early noughties. If you still think in those terms, or maybe in making mobile apps terms, I ask you to go back to Woermann, to Rosenfeld and Morville, making the complex clear, or designing shared information spaces, their vision of information architecture. It does not stop at representations of pages on any screen. It never did. This is not a matter that concerns one's individual professional practice or identity. Some of us will design information architectures for websites and mobile apps only, until they pry the last one out of our dead cold hands. But many others don't. Some designed information architectures that structure state or city-level systems, policies, governments, products, services, experiences. This concerns the evolution of the field. We cannot keep defining information architecture through the incidental outcomes that brought it to the mainstream in another century. Websites were the only shared digital information spaces we had. They are not anymore. Digital physical information space is where we live now, not an elsewhere, not the web as a separate word, but an ever-present layer tightly integrated into the fabric of reality. We took more than 5 billion photos per day and around 1.7 trillion photos total in 2024. What would you think of me if I told you that all those photos are not really photography, since no film cameras, dark rooms, or chemical baths were involved? Information architecture is websites as much as photography is dark rooms and baths, not much. Can you really believe that the transportation system in London doesn't have an information architecture? Do you really think that Netflix or Spotify don't have an information architecture? It may be bad, but it's still there. All of this real-time, on-demand information is architected. And it runs deeper than that. Disneyland has an information architecture, one built to keep you happy, make you move through the park, eat more than you should, and fill up the mouse's pockets. Books have an information architecture. Houses have an information architecture. Stores have an information architecture. All things, artifacts, systems, concepts, policies have an information architecture. You may dislike calling it that, and that's fair. You may have never thought about it that way, and that's fair also. Call it structure if you prefer, but that doesn't change the fact that this is what information architecture is about. The structural backbone that supports an experience by making sure that what is complex is understandable, visible, and actionable. The structures we create in digital space are the abstraction of the structures we create in physical space. We only know the word by being in the word, being here. We built homes on the web because we built homes in our cities. All space is human space, and human space now blends digital and physical, the screen and the word. The word embodies information. Information is embodied into the word or embedded into the word. So we need information architecture to make our day-to-day experiences and our connected lives more humane, meaningful, valuable for everyone. We need information architecture to make artificial intelligence human and planet-centered and avoid treating it as a mathematical problem, ignoring the messiness of the world it comes from and in which we embed it. We need information architecture for cars, drones, robots, all connected things that acquire, process, use, and transmit information, and for extended reality spaces. We need information architecture to help us understand and solve the world's pressing social and environmental challenges. So 60 years plus from Park, 14 years into the success that is World AI Day, how do we adapt information architecture for an evolving world? We need to let go. Information architecture flows in the spaces that connect everything: people, places, products, agents, and services. Its purpose is to make the complex clear, and making the complex clear has never been so valuable. Make it count. The future is yours to make. Thank you.
Super strong talk. I thoroughly encourage you, if you haven't, to watch the full film version. It's really good content. But let's take some questions. There's one question that's come in. As someone that teaches information architecture, how are you teaching contemporary IA so that new practitioners understand the broader scope of the field? So sort of maybe beyond the web, into the third wave.
Sure. It's a very good question. By doing quite a lot of the assembling of the students when they come in the very first year, I think it's our own experience as well. We tend to immediately go to abstractions that live on screens because this is what we're used to. So we spend a good chunk of the initial courses where we meet students first, be it at the undergraduate or at the graduate level, depending on what we are doing, by basically taking them away, sort of like detoxing them from, using computers and the like. My first exercise with students, just to be very practical, is about organizing a rack of spices in their kitchen and figuring out what spices they have, giving them spices in case they don't have many spices, and making them think about who's the person. Is it you? Is it your friends? Is it somebody else? How is your kitchen laid out? Where do you keep your spices? Have you thought about, having them on a rack, in a drawer? What is the order that you would go? Why would you say that alphabetical order is a great way to, place your spices in the drawer? That makes no sense. Let's think about this again. So we spend quite a lot of time trying to get them to understand the thing that I mentioned very briefly in the talk, that is all the orders that we have invented for digital. We really haven't invented for digital. They come from our experience of physical space. So we torture them a bit, that's what I would say, and keep them away from computers and make them think about socks in drawers, spices in kitchens, hats on racks, and animals in zoos, for example, in order to then allow them to get back to computers and screens.
That's super cool. And if you go home, the next time you're in your kitchen, look at your spices. I have a question from the back. I'm just going to go to the back. Got about maybe 2 minutes.
Hi. It's loud. So when I was working about 15 years ago, I worked with people who have the title information architect in their job title. That's pretty much gone. Maybe it's coming back recently, but it then disappeared for like 10 years and nobody was really doing it. Content designers have come onto the scene and they're sort of picking it up a bit. In the absence of somebody who's got the job title information architect, what do we do? Who picks it up? Do we all do it, share it, or do we just make the content designers do it all?
That's a very good question. And one of the big things that we have in the field, it's difficult to give one single, concise and solid answer to this. But I would just say, from my perspective, and as a teacher, as an educator right now, I'm way more concerned with the fact that we distribute information architecture to all of the people that have a need for it. And that includes content designers, interaction designers, service designers, product designers. And not only that, but also, all of the business, the decisional layers in any organization need to have a, passable understanding of what happens with the way we structure and organize information. But of course, the fact that we are not seeing the term also implies a lack of visibility that in the long run hurts, generally speaking, the field from that perspective. So it's a complicated answer. I had a conversation with Peter Morville, I think going back 14 years now, where he was just saying, I will be an information architect until the day I die, and I don't care about information architecture. And I think he meant I'm not concerned what happens. This is the way I am. And I made a point of saying, I don't really care if my title becomes Grand Poobah of this or that, as long as there's information architecture as a field, because it's too valuable to be tied to my own personal identity. So I don't really have an answer. I'm trying to make it as much as a diffuse practice as I can, because I know that my students will rarely receive the job title of information architects. So it's much better to have people around that know, oh, this thing we're doing, it's information architecture, even though my title is service designer or visual designer or whatever type of designer they end up being. I'm not sure if this is an answer, but I hope it's, close enough to being one.